In October of 1914, an admiral who had served the British Royal Navy with distinction for more than 4 decades was forced from his post as First Sea Lord. The charge against him was not incompetence, it was birth. The simple fact of having been born in the German Grand Duchy of Hesse rather than on British soil. Within 3 years, his entire family would erase their old name from public memory and take up an English-sounding one invented by Buckingham Palace itself. How did this family turn itself from disgraced foreigners into architects of the modern British monarchy? And what truths did they bury beneath the polished surface of their 20th century legend? Stay with me, and we will pull the thread. The Battenbergs entered history through what the courts of Europe politely called a Morganatic union, a marriage between unequal partners that conferred no full royal rank on the children it produced. A prince of the Grand Ducal House of Hesse fell in love with a woman of lower birth in the middle of the 19th century, and from that match came a line of children who carried the name Battenberg but lacked the sovereign blood that opened the great courts of the continent. They had no kingdom, no army, and very little money worth speaking of. To rise, they would have to marry well, and over the following decades they did so with relentless ambition, weaving their bloodline into the British and Russian imperial families through a series of careful matches that bought them proximity without true power. Prince Louis of Battenberg, born in 1854, embodied that strategy in its sharpest form. He left his German homeland as a teenager, naturalized as a British subject, and joined the Royal Navy at the height of Imperial Britain's command of the seas. Across 40 years, he climbed steadily through the ranks, marrying along the way Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria herself. By 1912, Louis had reached the office of First Sea Lord, the professional head of the entire Royal Navy. His career looked like a model of integration, the story of a foreign-born aristocrat who had earned his place at the summit of British power through talent and loyalty. Then, in August of 1914, within weeks of Britain declaring war on Germany, the British press began circling Prince Louis with open hostility, asking why a man with a German accent and a German title still commanded the Empire's fleet. Public feeling turned vicious as the war ground on. Dachshunds were stoned in the streets. German bakeries had their windows smashed. Anyone with a continental surname fell under suspicion. By October, the pressure had become unbearable, and Louis resigned, decades of service swept aside in a single political moment. According to his biographer Richard Huff, the British establishment did not seriously believe Louis was disloyal. The image of a German-born admiral commanding the fleet, while British boys died in Flanders, had simply become impossible to defend. The deeper crisis arrived in 1917. The war had ground on for 3 brutal years, and the monarchy itself now faced uncomfortable questions about its own German origins. King George V, of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, watched as his cousin Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown by revolutionaries in Russia, and Republican feeling began creeping westward across Europe. George chose to act decisively. By royal proclamation, he renamed his own dynasty the House of Windsor and ordered every relative bearing a German title to anglicize their names without delay. Battenberg became Mountbatten, a plain English translation. Prince Louis was handed a British peerage as the Marquis of Milford Haven, a soft compensation for the public humiliation he had endured 3 years before. As Hugo Vickers documents in his Life of Princess Alice, the whole operation amounted to a piece of carefully engineered political theater, designed to obscure German heritage from a public still mourning hundreds of thousands of war dead. This renaming would prove to be the founding act of a much larger pattern. From this moment onward, the family understood, at a level deeper than instinct, that survival depended on narrative control above all else, and that almost any inconvenient truth could be buried beneath enough effort and enough connection. Battenberg vanished from the public record. In its place stood Mountbatten, a brand more than a lineage, ready for the century ahead. George Mountbatten, the elder son of Prince Louis, became the second Marquis of Milford Haven on his father's death in 1921. Outwardly, he cut the figure of a respectable naval officer and aristocrat. He had served in the war, married a Russian aristocrat named Countess Nadezhda de Torby, and moved through the upper reaches of British society with the easy entitlement of a man born into it. Behind the public face, lay a private world the family would spend decades concealing. George amassed what the biographer Andrew Lowney has described as one of the largest private collections of pornography and erotica in early 20th century Europe. It ran to thousands of volumes, photographs, and printed odds and ends, much of it explicit by the standards of any age, and a good deal of it startling even by the standards of the 1920s and 1930s. When George died suddenly of bone marrow cancer in 1938, the family faced an embarrassing problem. Destroying the collection would have raised awkward questions about why it had existed at all, and an auction was unthinkable. Quiet negotiation produced the answer. George's collection was given to the British Museum, where it entered the institution's notorious private case, a restricted archive of erotic and obscene material kept locked away from ordinary readers for most of the 20th century. His finances proved equally awkward. He had run through money with a recklessness that left his widow heavily in debt and forced his younger brother Dickie to step in again and again to manage the fallout. The pattern would become familiar across the whole family in the decades that followed. Aristocratic privilege, expensive tastes, and inherited closeness to power, all of it masking a chronic shortage of actual capital, all of it requiring constant management of appearances and constant favors called in from wealthier relatives whenever the bills became impossible. While the Battenberg name was being buried in Britain, the continental branches of the family went on living the unstable lives of post-war European royalty. Princess Alice of Battenberg, Prince Louis's eldest daughter, had been born deaf in 1885 at Windsor Castle, and she learned to lip-read in 3 languages before marrying Prince Andrew of Greece in 1903. By the early 1920s, her adopted country was coming apart. A failed military campaign in Asia Minor against the new Turkish Republic ended in catastrophe, and the Greek monarchy was overthrown soon after. Prince Andrew had commanded a division in the disastrous Anatolian campaign and now faced trial for treason, coming within hours of being shot. It was the personal intervention of King George V of Britain, who dispatched a Royal Navy cruiser to lift the family out, that saved him from the firing squad. Alice fled into European exile with her children. The infant Prince Philip traveled in an orange crate that served as a makeshift cot. The years that followed crushed Alice. The trauma of the near execution, the loss of her home, the wandering existence of stateless royalty, and an increasingly distant marriage all bore down on her in steady accumulation. By the late 1920s, she had begun to experience religious visions, claiming intimate communication with Christ and the saints during long periods of withdrawal from the household. Her family chose to act in 1930, after months of erratic behavior, committing her against her will to the Bellevue Sanatorium at Kreuzlingen in Switzerland, where the doctors diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. Her 4 daughters were teenagers or young women by then. Philip, the son, was 9, and he would not see his mother again for years. The treatment Alice received at Kreuzlingen reads, almost a century later, like a catalog of the era's worst psychiatric instincts. Sigmund Freud was consulted on her case. Vickers records that Freud attributed her religious visions to sexual frustration, and that his recommendation was direct. Her ovaries, he advised, should be irradiated with X-rays to force premature menopause, removing what he believed to be the root biological cause of her symptoms. The procedure was carried out without her consent, and it caused lifelong physical complications. No evidence exists that it improved her mental state in any measurable way. What followed complicates the picture in ways biographers have struggled to capture in a single sentence. She emerged from the sanatorium in the late 1930s, drifted through European hotels and boarding houses for several years, and eventually returned to Athens during the Second World War. Greece by then lay under Axis occupation, and the country's Jewish population, in particular the ancient Sephardic community of Thessaloniki, was being deported to Auschwitz. In the capital, Alice quietly sheltered the family of a former Greek member of parliament named Chaim Cohen in her own home, a house that sat almost across the street from the Gestapo headquarters. She protected them through the entire occupation. After the war, she founded a Greek Orthodox nursing order, dressed for the rest of her life in the gray robes of a religious sister, and was in time recognized by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations. She died at Buckingham Palace in 1969. Her final wish was to be buried in Jerusalem, beside her aunt, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who had been murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918. The British royal family, faintly embarrassed by the mother of the Duke of Edinburgh, took years to honor the request. Her body was finally moved to a convent on the Mount of Olives in 1988. Alice had 4 daughters, and what happened to them in the 1930s would become one of the most carefully managed elements of the entire post-war royal story. All 4 married into German aristocratic families during the years when the Nazi Party rose from a fringe movement to absolute power across the Reich. 3 of them, and several of their husbands, joined the party itself. Princess Sophie, the youngest of Philip's sisters, married Prince Christoph of Hesse in 1930 when she was only 16. Christoph rose quickly within the Third Reich. As the historian Jonathan Petropoulos documents in Royals in the Reich, he became head of the secret intelligence service inside Hermann Göring's air ministry, the Forschungsamt, an agency that tapped the telephones of foreign embassies and political enemies, and he held the rank of SS Oberfuhrer. Sophie was, by every account, an enthusiastic National Socialist in her own right, and she named one of her young sons, Karl Adolf, in honor of the Führer himself. Princess Cecilie, Philip's 3rd sister, married Georg Donatus, the hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine. Both of them formally joined the Nazi Party in May of 1937, and 6 months later, they were dead. The family had been flying from Frankfurt to London for the wedding of Prince Ludwig of Hesse when their aircraft went down in heavy fog at Ostend, in Belgium. Cecilie, 8 months pregnant, and the newborn whose remains were found in the wreckage, along with her husband and their 2 young sons, all died at the crash site. The funeral in Darmstadt the following week became a state occasion of the Third Reich. Senior Nazi officials attended, including representatives of Göring, and Hitler himself sent flowers and a personal message of condolence. There is no plausible reading of the photographs other than the obvious one. The future husband of Queen Elizabeth II, 8 years before he married her, walked in a Nazi funeral procession. Princess Margarita married Prince Gottfried of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, who joined the Nazi Party and served as a Wehrmacht officer on the Eastern Front. Theodora, the eldest, married Berthold, the Margrave of Baden, an officer who served in the German army before being invalided out after a wound in France in 1940. The pattern across the 4 marriages was unmistakable. So when Philip married Princess Elizabeth in November of 1947, none of his sisters were invited. The palace explanation was diplomatic. British feeling toward Germans, in a country still living under rationing and counting its war dead, would not have tolerated their presence at the wedding. As Philip Ziegler observes in his official life of Dickie Mountbatten, the decision was driven primarily by King George VI and his courtiers, with Dickie's full support throughout. Philip's sisters were quietly told they could not come. The wedding photographs that became the founding images of the modern British royal family contained no German princes, no widows of SS officers, and no children with names like Karl Adolf. A narrative had been cleaned. Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, known all his life as Dickie, was born in 1900 at Frogmore House, in the grounds of Windsor Castle. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a nephew of the last Tsarina of Russia, and a second cousin of the future King George VI. His earliest memories took in visits to the Russian imperial court, summer holidays in the German Rhineland, and the slow public dismantling of his father's career in 1914. The boy was 14 when Prince Louis was forced to resign as First Sea Lord. That shame, recounted in every biography from Ziegler onward, marked Dickie for good. He would spend his entire adult life working to reverse it. He entered the Royal Navy through Osborne and Dartmouth, and served as a junior officer at the close of the First World War. In 1922, he married Edwina Ashley, the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Cassel, the German Jewish financier and confidant of King Edward VII, a connection that made her one of the wealthiest women in Britain. The perpetually shaky Mountbatten finances were rescued by the marriage, and so was Dickie's social standing. The Prince of Wales acted as best man. The young couple settled into a glittering and very public life of yachts, fast cars, Hollywood friendships, and dinners with the political class on 3 continents. Dickie himself possessed an unusual gift for self-presentation, grasping, decades before most of his peers in the British establishment, that the modern world ran on image as much as on substance. Journalists were cultivated, photographers welcomed, friendships forged with Noel Coward, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks. By the late 1930s, he had become one of the most visible naval officers in Britain, his promotions quickened by royal connection, his public profile built carefully on sustained press attention. Charming, energetic, ambitious, and, as later events would suggest, perhaps overrated. The Second World War made Dickie Mountbatten a household name. In 1939, he took command of HMS Kelly, a new destroyer commissioned at the start of hostilities. The ship served under him for 2 years, and in those 2 years it was torpedoed, mined, bombed, and finally sunk. And Dickie emerged from each disaster with his reputation enlarged rather than diminished. Within the Navy itself, the criticism ran deep. Senior officers questioned his seamanship, noting that the Kelly had been involved in a string of serious incidents that had little to do with the enemy. In one collision in heavy weather, the ship's bow was crumpled. In an action off the Norwegian coast, she was torpedoed and limped home in a state that some officers privately blamed on Dickie's decisions rather than on misfortune. As Ziegler documents in painful detail, the official record carries a quiet undercurrent of professional doubt about whether Dickie possessed the technical competence expected of a destroyer captain. The Battle of Crete, in May of 1941, sealed the matter. The Kelly, operating with the destroyer Kashmir, came under sustained attack by German dive bombers off the Cretan coast, and both ships were sunk, with more than half of the Kelly's crew dying in the water. Dickie was pulled from the sea by the destroyer Kipling. He emerged from the loss of his ship not as a captain whose judgment had cost more than 100 lives, but as a romantic war hero whose courage under fire had become the stuff of legend. The transformation was not an accident. Dickie's friend Noel Coward gained access to the story and built the 1942 film In Which We Serve around it, playing, himself, a thinly disguised version of Dickie as the heroic Captain Kinross. The film was an immediate success, one of the most acclaimed British productions of the war, and it won an honorary Academy Award. By the time the credits had finished running, the public memory of HMS Kelly had been rewritten. A torpedoed and bombed destroyer had become a symbol of Royal Navy resilience, and her captain, a national figure beyond easy criticism. In October of 1941, Dickie was appointed Chief of Combined Operations, the body responsible for planning amphibious raids on the European coast. He held the post through 1942 and into early 1943, the period in which combined operations developed the doctrine and equipment that would later make the Normandy landings possible. It was a substantial promotion for an officer of his actual seniority, placing him in close contact with Winston Churchill, the chiefs of staff, and senior American commanders. Few officers of his rank had ever climbed so fast. His defining operation was the raid on Dieppe in August of 1942. The plan called for a large-scale assault on the German-held French port, carried out mainly by Canadian troops with British commandos and a small American contingent in support. The goals were to test the German coastal defenses, to seize prisoners and intelligence, and to show Stalin that Britain remained committed to opening a second front. Catastrophe followed. Of roughly 6,000 men landed, more than 3,300 became casualties. The Royal Regiment of Canada lost over 95% of its strength on the beach. The German defenders, well prepared for an assault on a heavily fortified town, cut the attackers down before they could move more than a few yards inland. Tanks foundered on the shingle. The losses in the air battle overhead exceeded those of any single day in the Battle of Britain. By midday, the operation had collapsed, and the survivors were being lifted off the beaches under withering fire. Dickie spent the rest of his life arguing that Dieppe had been a necessary sacrifice, that without the lessons learned there, the Normandy landings of 1944 would have failed at far greater cost. He repeated the argument in lectures, articles, and television interviews for more than 30 years. Most military historians have rejected it. Ziegler himself, writing the official biography with full access to Dickie's own papers, concludes that the planning was rushed, the intelligence inadequate, and the tactical assumptions deeply flawed. Canadian historians have been less charitable still. The Dieppe raid remains, for many in Canada, the worst military failure in their nation's history, and Dickie the man who designed it. In March of 1947, Dickie arrived in Delhi as the last Viceroy of India. The British government under Clement Attlee had decided to withdraw from the subcontinent, and his task was to manage the transition with as much dignity as the situation allowed. He had been given an end date of June 1948. On his own authority, Dickie brought it forward by 10 months to August of 1947, compressing an already impossible timetable into something tighter still. The decision to accelerate Indian independence is one of the most contested in the imperial history of the century. His defenders, including some scholars sympathetic to his position, argue that India in 1947 stood on the brink of full civil war between the Hindu-majority Congress and the Muslim League, that sectarian violence had already broken out in the Punjab and in Calcutta, and that Indian leaders themselves, Nehru and Patel among them, were pressing for an immediate British departure. On this reading, Dickie was acknowledging reality rather than imposing a timetable. His critics describe a different picture. The advanced schedule left the Boundary Commission, chaired by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, with barely a few weeks to draw the lines that would divide the subcontinent. Radcliffe had never set foot in India before. He worked from outdated maps and incomplete census data. The boundaries he drew were not even announced until 2 days after independence, leaving millions of people unaware until the last moment whether they now lived in India or in Pakistan. The communal violence already simmering exploded across the new borders with a savagery that has scarred the region ever since. The numbers remain disputed. Estimates of those killed in the violence of partition range from 200,000 to more than 2 million, and estimates of those driven from their homes range from 12 to 18 million. As Nisat Hajari documents in Midnight's Furies, trains arrived at stations in both new countries filled with corpses, and whole villages were burned to the ground. The historian Alex von Tunzelmann concludes that the haste imposed by Dickie's timetable was a genuine contributing factor to the scale of the disaster, even if not its only cause. The blame is shared, but a portion of it is unmistakably his. Throughout his time in India, and in the years that followed, Dickie's marriage was operating under unusual conditions. Edwina Mountbatten had formed a deep emotional, and very probably physical, bond with Jawaharlal Nehru, the leader of the Congress, and, from August of 1947, the first Prime Minister of independent India. The documentation runs deep. Their surviving correspondence, the testimony of family members including the Mountbatten's own daughter Pamela Hicks, and the accounts of those who watched the three of them together in the closing months of British rule, all confirm the relationship. Its exact physical nature has been debated by biographers. Janet Morgan, in her authorized Life of Edwina, described it as a passionate intimacy that may have stopped short of a full sexual affair, though her conclusion has been challenged by later writers, Lowney among them. Whatever the precise mechanics, the emotional intensity was undisguised. Edwina and Nehru exchanged letters until her death in 1960, when she was found, on a goodwill tour in Borneo, with his letters beside her bed. Dickie himself was, by every account, fully aware of the relationship and tolerated it, perhaps because he was conducting affairs of his own, perhaps because he calculated that Edwina's closeness to Nehru gave him diplomatic access of an extraordinary kind. The implications have unsettled historians ever since. The last Viceroy of India was negotiating the end of British rule with a man who was sleeping, or close to sleeping, with the Viceroy's wife. His defenders argue the relationship had no operational effect on the negotiations. His critics point out that this is impossible to know. What is known is that Dickie remained in regular correspondence with Nehru after 1947, advised him on diplomatic matters, and used the connection as a personal channel into Indian policy for over a decade. Whether this was British soft power, or the Indian capture of a British asset, or something more ambiguous, is a question with no clean answer. In the late 1940s, when Dickie was being weighed for senior appointments connected to the New Atlantic Alliance and to intelligence work in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation ran background checks on him. The resulting files, declassified decades later and now available through the Bureau's public archive, contain a collection of informant reports and society gossip that paint an unflattering picture. According to several sources interviewed by agents, Dickie was a man of, in their words, extremely low morals, with rumors of homosexual conduct and what the period coyly called perversion. What these files actually represent has been debated since their release. They are not the Bureau's conclusions. They are raw, collected intelligence, the chatter that any prominent foreign figure would have generated in mid-century Washington, and the Bureau reached no verdict on whether any of it was true. Andrew Lowney, in his 2019 book The Mountbattens, treats the files as one strand among several, pointing to a private life more complicated than the public one, a life the family worked hard to keep out of the newspapers while Dickie lived. There is one episode, late in his career, that complicates the easy picture of Dickie as a pure schemer for power, and it deserves a place in any honest account. In May of 1968, retired by then as chief of the defense staff, he agreed to a meeting arranged by the newspaper editor Hugh Cudlip at the request of Cecil King, the chairman of the company that owned the Daily Mirror and one of the most powerful press barons in the country. King believed Britain was sliding toward collapse, and he had come to propose that, when the elected government disintegrated and there was, as he put it, blood in the streets, the nation would turn to a figure like Mountbatten to head an emergency administration, a government of national salvation outside Parliament. The government's own chief scientific advisor, Solly Zuckerman, was in the room, and he answered before Dickie could. It amounted, Zuckerman said, to rank treachery, and he walked out. Dickie said the same, and dismissed King from the House. By his own later account, his reply to the suggestion that he take over the country was to throw the man out. Whatever else can be laid at his door, when the establishment came to him with the offer of unelected power, the master of image turned it down and called it treason. By the 1960s, with his public career winding down, Dickie turned his attention to the next generation. His grandnephew, Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, had grown up partly in his shadow, and Dickie had been a presence in the boy's life since infancy. He took up the role of mentor with characteristic vigor, and his influence on Charles's emotional and marital formation would prove lasting. His advice to Charles on the subject of women was set down in writing and survives in correspondence quoted by Jonathan Dimbleby in his authorized biography of the Prince of Wales. The older man counseled the young prince to enjoy himself, to sow his wild oats widely, to gather experience with as many women as he could before marriage. When the time came to settle, however, the rules reversed entirely. The bride must be young, inexperienced, and possessed of, in Dickie's own phrase, no past. She must come from the right kind of aristocratic family, be unformed enough to be molded into the role, and above all, be incapable of generating any scandal of her own. He even had a candidate in mind, his own granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull, a few years younger than Charles, well-bred, and conveniently, a direct descendant of Dickie himself. A marriage between the two would have carried the Mountbatten line into the direct succession to the British throne for the first time. Across the 1970s, Dickie engineered occasions for the two to spend time together and wrote to Charles repeatedly urging the match. In the end, Amanda herself was the obstacle, declining Charles's eventual proposal in 1979. Her reasons are not fully clear from the public record, but the timing matters. For that same year, Dickie was killed by a bomb, and her own brother died in the same blast. The proposal came not long after, and she refused it. The trauma, the loss, and the prospect of a life lived wholly under public scrutiny appear to have weighed against acceptance. Charles eventually married Lady Diana Spencer in July of 1981, and the criteria she met were the criteria Dickie had laid down. 19 years old, from one of the oldest aristocratic families in England, with no romantic past, and, by her own later admission, deeply naive about what royal marriage would actually involve. Diana fitted the template precisely. The marriage that followed proved disastrous, in ways an entire industry of biography has since documented. But the framework that selected her came directly from a man who had been dead for 2 years before the wedding took place. On the morning of the 27th of August, 1979, Dickie took his fishing boat, Shadow 5, out of the harbour at Mullimore, in County Sligo, on the western coast of Ireland. He was 79. For decades he had spent his summers at his Irish home, Classybon Castle, moving among the small port and its people with the easy familiarity of an annual visitor. The Provisional IRA, which had been waging an armed campaign in Northern Ireland for almost a decade, had marked him as a target. A bomb had been placed aboard the boat the previous night. It was detonated by remote control as Shadow 5 moved out into the bay. Dickie was killed almost instantly, along with 3 others on board. His grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull, a boy of 14, died at the scene. Paul Maxwell, a local boy of 15 hired to help with the boat, died too. And the Dowager Lady Brabourne, the 83-year-old mother of Dickie's son-in-law, died of her injuries the following day. The IRA claimed responsibility within hours, describing Dickie as a symbol of British imperialism and the killing as an execution. For the British public, and for the royal family in particular, the assassination was the closest the Troubles had ever come to the upper levels of the establishment. Dickie was given a state funeral at Westminster Abbey, and the Queen, her sons, and Charles above all, were visibly devastated by the loss. His death closed his life on a note of historical irony that even a sympathetic biographer cannot avoid. A man who had presided over the partition of India, an event that cost 1 million lives or more, in part through his administrative haste, was himself killed by a sectarian conflict on another set of partitioned islands. The architects of empire, in the end, were not safe even on a fishing boat off the Sligo coast. The wheel had come round. Before we close, the figure of Prince Philip himself deserves a clearer accounting than he often receives, in both directions. Born in Corfu in 1921, exiled in infancy, raised across 3 countries by relatives because his mother was institutionalized and his father had retreated to Monte Carlo, Philip survived an emotionally bleak childhood through resilience and a streetwise adaptability that royal biographers tend to admire. He was, by every account, intelligent and personally charming. He was also, it should be said plainly, a genuinely capable naval officer in his own right, mentioned in dispatches for his conduct at the night battle of Cape Matapan in 1941. A man with a real war behind him, rather than a manufactured one. And he was, in public, the holder of a long record of remarks that the British press came to call gaffes, and that others called something less generous. Speaking to British students at Xi'an during a state visit to China in 1986, he warned them that staying in the country much longer would give them slitty eyes. Meeting an Aboriginal Australian leader in 2002, he asked whether the man's people still threw spears at one another. A Scottish driving instructor, in 1995, was told that the trick was working out how the locals managed to stay sober long enough to pass the test. The list goes on. After surgery in 2013, he asked a Filipino nurse whether the Philippines was half empty, given how many of its people went abroad to work. His defenders have called these remarks mischievous, generational, the prerogative of a man who refused to be trained into blandness. His critics have noted that mischief and prejudice are not mutually exclusive, that the consistency of the targets across decades suggested something other than random eccentricity, and that the patrician confidence to make such jokes in the first place was inherited directly from the imperial culture in which his relatives had been embedded. The Mountbatten branch of the family had built its public image on the management of optics. Philip had grown up inside that family's orbit. The fact that he occasionally spoke without management was less a departure from the family pattern than a glimpse of what the management usually concealed. When he died in April of 2021, at 99, his obituaries treated the gaffes as charming character, and his scaled-down pandemic funeral was watched around the world. Something else was buried with him. Gone with the coffin was the last living link between the modern British monarchy and the European royal world that had collapsed in 1917, the world of the Battenbergs, of the Hessian, and Greek and Russian cousin-ages, of a continental aristocracy whose German wing had marched in SS uniforms and whose British wing had renamed itself to survive. To look at this dynasty across more than a century is to see a single, sustained operation of image management. The list runs long. From Prince Louis's Anglicization of his identity in 1917, to the quiet bequest of George's erotica to the British Museum in 1938, to Dickie's commissioning of In Which We Serve in 1942, to the wartime erasure of Philip's German sisters from the family photographs in 1947, to the post-war softening of the Dieppe and Kelly criticisms, to the partition narrative built up across the 1960s, to the careful minimizing of Edwina's relationship with Nehru in the authorized lives, the family has worked, generation after generation, to keep the public version of its story cleaner than the private record warrants. And the work has been broadly successful. Dickie survives in popular memory as a war hero, an architect of Indian independence, and a tragic victim of Republican violence. His failures, his arrogance, the doubts of his fellow officers, the human cost of partition, the ambition that drove the Dieppe disaster, are all set down in serious biographies and rarely reach the wider public picture at all. Princess Alice's genuine heroism, a story that truly deserves to be remembered, has been folded into a narrative that quietly leaves out the full extent of the family's other entanglements with the Reich. Philip's remarks have been domesticated into anecdote. The German origins of the dynasty have receded into footnotes. What the historical record shows, read end to end, is a family that arrived in Britain as minor Morganatic royalty, married its way into the establishment, survived the catastrophe of the First World War through a change of name, weathered its own connections to the Reich through the cooperation of the palace and the press, made a war hero out of an officer of decidedly mixed competence, exported the pattern of curated marriage into the next generation through Charles and Diana, and emerged at the end of the 20th century as a structural part of the British monarchy itself. The Battenbergs lost a country in 1917. Their descendants, a century later, sit at the center of one. That is not the story usually told. The version that has reached the public is shorter, cleaner, and far more flattering than the evidence warrants. And the gap between the two, laid out side by side across a century, is not an accident at all. It is the family's principal achievement. Tell me in the comments which detail changed the way you see this story. I read every single comment. Subscribe to the Royal Thread. Every story is connected, and the next thread is already being pulled.